Every generation has its secrets. Stories buried in the dust and silence, where truth was traded for power and justice was left waiting in the dark. These are the moments history tried to forget, where the guilty wore crowns and the innocent were written out of the story. What was hidden will be uncovered. This is the sacred scandal. Dark deeds, divine justice. It begins with a rumor so old, no one remembers the first mouth that whispered it. A time before cities had names, before borders and flags, before the ground was scraped by empires and the sky was cut by towers. People were new then, busy with the business of living, digging, planting, building fires that smoked into the evening air. And somewhere in that hush, someone noticed that they were not alone. Not wolves in the brush, not enemies in the hills, something else. They were seen rarely, and yet often enough to earn a name. The kind of name that doesn't explain anything. It only makes you lean closer. Tall, terrible, beautiful in a way that makes the spine stiffen. Eyes that seem to hold too much knowledge, too much age, too much judgment. They watched, they waited, and when they finally crossed the line between seeing and acting, the world bent under the weight. The old story says they chose. They did not stumble or drift. They chose. They stepped down. And the first sign that something irreversible had happened was not thunder or fire or a flash in the night sky. It was far quieter. It was the sound of doors being shut from the inside. The sound of a new family being made where no family should have been possible. No one knows what was said in those houses, what promises were whispered, what gifts were offered, but the pairings began. And once they began, they did not stop. Daughters were taken, not one or two, not as an accident, not as a fever, a pattern. A plan. And the children who followed were not ordinary. Ask 10 people in that era what those children were, you'd get 10 answers. None of them comforting. Some said giants, some said warriors, some said the kind of men whose names you hear in stories for centuries afterward. Because no one can figure out how else to explain what they did. Mighty ones, men of renown, the kind that leave footprints deeper than they should, and shadows longer than the sun allows. That's the official story, the one you hear when people still trust each other enough to speak. But the unofficial story, the one told around fires when the wind rises, says this. Once the boundary was crossed, other boundaries blurred. Right and wrong, sacred and common, yours and mine, it's not that everything suddenly became monstrous. It's that the ordinary became unmoored. Small cruelties were laughed at. Big lies were admired. Strength no longer protected, it performed. Knowledge no longer guided, it devoured. And the ones who should have known better, who were supposed to be guardians, watchers, stopped keeping watch. They took, and the ground learned their weight. Listen long enough in that world, and you'll hear a mother describe a son who stares too long at the horizon, who breaks tools and then breaks bones with the same cold patience. You'll hear a father explain away the roar of a crowd after his boy knocks a man to the earth, how the cheering sounds a little too hungry. You'll hear laughter at night, and it won't be the good kind. You'll hear silence in the morning, the kind that follows after something has been done and no one wants to acknowledge it. If you could have stood in the middle of that age and felt it with bare hands, you might have said the air was heavy. That's the word people use when they don't have another. Heavy. The way a storm makes the sky sink until the birds fly low and cattle stop moving. And at some point, the story says the heaviness got noticed. Noticed by more than men. And judgment started to gather. Not the quick kind any one person can dish out. Not a feud, not revenge for a single act. Something wider. Something slower. Something that sees all the threads at once. How the small choices have been stitching together into a shroud. But that's getting ahead of ourselves. Before the judgment, there's a question. In stories like this, there's always a question. Who were they? Because if you can name a thing, sometimes you can control it. And if you can't control it, at least you can pretend you understand it. The old text call them by a title that sounds simple until you look at it sideways. Sons of God. That's one of those phrases that can make scholars fight and mystics smile. If you want the safe answer, you say rulers, nobles, powerful men. If you want the unsettling answer, you say it like the oldest storytellers said it. Beings not bound by our dust. Watchers from above, crossing a line that should never be crossed. And then there are their children, the ones with names that ring like iron. Another word is used here too, Nephilim. Try to translate it and the word slides out of your fingers. Giants, fallen ones, mighty. Some words can't be locked in a box. They leak. When people argue about this story, they build towers of explanation. They make charts and timelines. They chase footnotes into the dark and come back with artifacts and poems and graves and sighs. But if you strip away the noise, what you're left with is a feeling, a sense that humanity woke up one morning and realized the world had shifted an inch out of true. Once you notice that, you can't unnotice it. This is what the shift felt like. The strong weren't strong for anyone but themselves. The brilliant weren't brilliant for the sake of truth. And the beautiful? Well, beauty is a terrible weapon when it's divorced from goodness. It cuts quietly, and the cuts add up. People started to talk about the old days. Even though the old days weren't that far behind them, they spoke about restraint and reverence as if those things were artifacts, as if they belonged in the ground. Meanwhile, the new men with the old names carved their initials into the world. They stacked stone and bone, built halls, took what they wanted, and told stories about themselves at banquets that lasted until nothing tasted like anything anymore. There's a detail in the oldest telling that you can miss if you're not careful. It says when these unions happen, when watchers took and children came, it was not a one-time event. It says it happened then and after, as if the line once crossed rarely gets redrawn, as if every boundary we erase teaches us how to erase the next one faster. And once the pattern set in, rot moved quietly through the beams. Not the kind you see until your hand goes right through the wood. Smiles got tighter, eyes got mean. Neighbors stopped being neighbors, and strangers stopped being human. You can tell a culture is dying when jokes become cruelties, and cruelties become entertainment. You can tell it's dying when no one bothers to hide their appetites anymore. There's another detail, an observation from the storyteller who watched all this with a broken heart. He said the thoughts of men were bent. Not sometimes, not on bad days, bent continually. He said the imagination itself had learned the wrong shape, and once it learned, it taught itself to keep learning. If you want to know why judgment gathers, there it is. When the last drops from the first storm sank into the dirt, people told themselves it was over. The strange visitors were gone. The families they'd touched had scattered. But rot doesn't vanish. It hides. It waits for dry wood. Years passed, maybe decades, and the children of that generation forgot the names their grandparents whispered in fear. But they remembered the lessons. Might makes right. Pleasure has no price, and power answers to no one. You can build a whole civilization on those lies. At least for a while. And they did. Stone replaced tents. Cities grew like weeds, each one louder than the last. Markets hummed, temples blazed, kings fought over rivers and rights. If you looked from the outside, you'd think the world was thriving. But if you listened, really listened, you could hear something off. The sound under the sound. A kind of hunger that never stopped chewing. It started small. Trades that left one man richer and 10 men broken. Then the broken men learned to break others, because that's how rot spreads. Quietly, efficiently. Soon, blood had a currency, and every altar smelled the same. What was once worship became transaction. What was once covenant became conquest. Stories from that age say the ground itself grew weary. The earth groaned beneath all that taking, the way an old table groans under too much weight. And somewhere watching, not the fallen ones, but the one who still kept watch. A line was being drawn again. The old chroniclers describe it almost clinically. The earth was filled with violence. Such a small sentence for so much pain. It doesn't list the screams or the fires or the songs sung over corpses. It just says filled, like a cup brimming over, like someone kept pouring and pouring and pouring and pouring until it spilled across everything. Noah was born into that world. The record doesn't tell us much about his childhood, only that he found favor. Favor is a strange word when everyone else has forgotten what grace looks like. Imagine being the one sane voice in a room full of laughter that never reaches the eyes. Imagine knowing the storm's coming when no one else will even look at the sky. There's an old legend from Mesopotamia, carved into clay long before Moses ever wrote his scroll. It speaks of a man who built a great boat because the gods were tired of human noise. That version is full of petty divinities and half-truths, but it hints at something shared. An echo of a moment everyone remembered, but few understood. Every culture kept a scar from that wound, a reminder that the sea once swallowed the earth. The details changed. The warning didn't. So Noah built. He built while his neighbors mocked him. He built while the mighty men threw feast and toasted their reflections. He built while the children of the fallen carved monuments to themselves. And every plank, every nail was an act of defiance. Not against men, but against decay itself. The watchers had taken. He would preserve. There's a rhythm to building in faith. It's slow, repetitive. The hammer falls like a heartbeat. Steady, certain. Each strike says, I believe there's still something worth saving. Each strike says, the world won't end with theft. It will end with rescue. And yet, even as the vessel took shape, the old corruption didn't sleep. Some say the Watcher's children tried to stop him, laughing as they tore down what he raised each day. Some say the laughter turned nervous when the clouds began to gather in ways no one had seen before. Maybe you've felt that kind of dread. The moment before consequences arrive, when everyone senses something is about to break, but no one wants to say it out loud. The air feels charged, metallic, the way it does before lightning. The animals move differently. Conversations die in the throat. The storytellers later called it the patience of God. Patience that waits until even mercy can't delay the tide any longer. And then came the sound. Not thunder yet. The first drops were almost kind. Soft taps on roofs like fingers asking to be let in. But then the ground began to tremble, and the river swelled, and the laughter turned to screams. What had been rumor became revelation. The old writings describe it without poetry. Fountains of the deep bursting, windows of heaven open. That's what happens when a world's foundations crack. Everything above and below joins in judgment. The seas didn't just rise, they remembered. But before the world went silent beneath the waves, there was a moment, one breath, when it could all still be heard. The shouts, the pounding fists, the desperate promises made to a God whose name had been used like currency for generations. And above it all, the steady beat of rain on wood. Hammer, hammer, hammer. Judgment, judgment, judgment. Until one sound stopped and the other didn't. When the waters finally calmed, they say the silence was unbearable. No bird song, no voices. Just the slap of waves against a hull carrying everything that hadn't drowned. Inside, the survivors didn't speak for a long time. Some silences are sacred because words would be blasphemy. Some silences are just disbelief. And high above the clouds, where the watchers once stood, the sky was empty again. But not forever. Because stories like this don't really end. They wait, they warn, and even now, if you walk long enough through ruins, or read too deeply into old inscriptions, you'll find reminders that humanity's hunger for forbidden knowledge never truly drowned. It just learned to hold its breath. When the world began again, it did not begin clean. The rain had washed away the filth, but not the memory. Memories cling to survivors. They hide under fingernails and behind eyelids. You can scrub a world, but the scent of judgment lingers. The survivors stepped out onto soil that still felt too soft, too new. The air was sharper, the sky lower, like the heavens themselves had drawn closer to listen. Noah and his family began again. They built, they planted, they offered sacrifices, but when the smoke rose, it rose through a silence that wasn't empty. It was listening. It was asking a question. Will it be different this time? Will it be different? People like to imagine that after a reckoning, the world just starts fresh. Like sin is a stain you can simply rinse out. But the truth is harder. The truth is that the flood may have ended the corruption of one generation, but it could not drown the human heart. Evil doesn't need a body to breathe, it only needs memory. It survives in stories, in the quiet temptations that whisper, you could be more than you are. The old texts hint that even after the flood, traces of those ancient giants remained. And also afterward, the line said. The implication chilling. Somehow, echoes of the Watcher's fall found new ways to live on. The names changed. Rephaim, Anakim, men of renown, but the pattern stayed the same. Pride reaching upward, boundaries being crossed, and the slow rot of power repeating itself. It's as if the world never stopped wanting to climb back to that forbidden line. Walk through history and you'll see it. Kingdoms crowned by men who called themselves divine, monuments reaching into clouds, armies that marched believing themselves chosen by fate. It's all the same hunger, wearing different crowns. Some scholars say the story of the Watchers is humanity's first cautionary tale about technology, about knowledge taken before it's earned. Others say it's about lust, about arrogance, about the danger of treating sacred things as trophies. But strip away the details, the warning is always this. Some knowledge corrupts, some desires consume, and some thresholds, once crossed, can never be uncrossed. There's a reason we still tell this story, because deep down we recognize ourselves in it. The Watchers were not human, but their mistake was. They wanted more. They wanted to touch what should have stayed beyond their reach. That's the root of every scandal, every tragedy, the refusal to be content with the limits of goodness. And yet, buried inside even that tragedy is something merciful. The flood wasn't only destruction, it was prevention. It was a rescue mission for meaning itself. If corruption had continued unchecked, the world would have collapsed under its own weight. Justice, in that moment, wasn't cruelty. It was surgery. It was setting a bone that had healed wrong, no matter how much it hurt to do it. After the waters receded, the bow appeared in the sky, a promise written in color instead of blood. It wasn't an erasure of the past, but a covenant that said, this won't happen again, not like this. The bow bent toward the earth like a weapon laid down. But if you've ever seen one in the right light, you know there's still tension in it. It's beautiful, but it's also a reminder. Peace held by restraint. Generations later, when people saw giants in the land again, or tyrants calling themselves God, they whispered the old name, Nephilim, the fallen ones. It wasn't always literal. Sometimes it was just a label for what felt too big, too cruel, too proud. The ancient warning still echoed. We've been here before. Archaeologists today dig through layers of dust, unearthing fragments of old epics that mirror the story. The Mesopotamian 7 sages, the Sumerian kings who ruled for centuries, the Greek myths of demigods and titans, each of them a shadow of this first scandal, like echoes bouncing down a long corridor of time. The languages differ, the pantheons multiply, but the pattern remains. Watchers fall, the world pays the price. And then there's us. We listen to these stories, comfortable behind microphones and screens, pretending we're just observers. But maybe the reason these tales still haunt us is because they're not finished. Maybe the Watchers is just another name for the part of us that refuses to stay grounded. The voice that says, why not? Who's watching? The answer, of course, is always the same. Someone is. Maybe that's what separates the fallen from the faithful. The willingness to stay in your lane. To remember that limits aren't prisons. They're guardrails. Maybe keeping watch was never about surveillance, but stewardship. And maybe, just maybe, the fall of the Watchers isn't a legend about beings long gone, but a warning about what happens when those who were meant to protect start to consume. If you walk outside on a night without clouds, when the stars are sharp and still, you might feel it. The weight of eyes on you. Not menacing, just aware. Maybe that's the echo of what was lost. The sense that the world is watched by something good. And maybe that's why the story had to be told again. Because we're still choosing what kind of watchers we'll be. Some stories warn us by terrifying us. This one warns us by recognizing us. Because every time humanity flirts with forbidden power, every time we use knowledge without wisdom, every time strength forgets mercy, we're standing where they stood. At the edge of a line that's older than memory, and every time we choose humility instead of pride, reverence instead of ownership, we rewrite the ending, even if just for a while. The world began again once before. Maybe it still can. The past may be carved in stone, but its secrets still bleed through the cracks.